So Matthew West, thank you for coming down today.
My pleasure. It's great to talk with you.
So tell me about your latest album. What is different about this album from your past music?
Well, you know, Live Forever actually has become the third album. There's been a big shift in my music making process that has involved the last 3 records I've done. And so Live Forever is sort of the completion of what I would call an accidental trilogy. 6 years ago, I had near career-threatening vocal cord surgery. And the doctor said that there was a chance I've sung my last song. And recovering from that throat surgery, I had several months of total silence while I waited to see if my voice was
you didn't talk at all?
Couldn't talk for 2 months. My wife said that was the greatest 2
That's the
months
best
of our
time of her
marriage.
life,
yeah.
right.
But during that 2 months, I did some serious soul searching and a lot of journaling. And one of the things I was starting to kind of center around was, you know, what if my voice comes back? How could I use my voice in a different way? And I kept coming onto this topic of how could I use my voice to give other people a voice? And that's what birthed an idea, a storytelling idea. But instead of me always being the storyteller, writing songs about my own life, I thought, what if I gave people a chance to tell me their story? And what if I wrote songs inspired by the true stories of people's lives who come to my shows or listen to my song on the radio or read The Blaze? And that was 6 years ago, and today I'm sitting here talking with you 6 years later, over 40,000 stories collected.
40,000.
And counting. Every single day, stories come in, and now a third record, 3 albums. I thought I was just gonna write a few songs. Now I've written 3 albums where every single song that I've written in the last 6 years has been inspired by somebody's true story.
So 40,000, have you read all of these? Have you personally looked at all of these stories?
I am personally reading through them all the time. Like literally, it's kind of like the scene in Bruce Almighty where Jim Carrey's character gets this brilliant idea to turn everybody's prayers into an email, and then it's like,
and this is what you've done in real
that's
real
what
life.
I've done in real life, and so literally every single day I chip away, and I feel like it's important for me personally to read the stories because people are trusting me with some of the maybe more raw or
So
vulnerable
what kinds
parts
of
of their stories.
You know, what are some of the issues that these people are going through?
Well, it runs the gamut. It's pretty unbelievable. To be blunt right off the bat, 1 out of every 5 stories I've read has dealt with the topic of abuse. People writing to me and sharing with me about some of the very broken chapters of their story, and sharing, hey, I was a victim of abuse, I'm still struggling, don't know how to figure it out. I get stories from teenagers who are absolutely wrecked when it comes to their self-image. They're looking in the mirror and they hate what they see because they've been made to feel like they don't measure up. They're not smart enough, attractive enough, skinny enough, you name it. And they're battling eating disorders or self-harm. I'm getting stories from marriages that are on the verge of divorce because of infidelity. Basically, you name the topic, the life topic, dysfunctional family, and on and on and on it goes.
How do you not get depressed going through all these things?
And I don't mean to sound like they're all depressing stories,
Right.
because one of the things that is a real common thread that is run through every story I read is that no matter how dark or how hurtful or how maybe hopeless a certain story might seem at a certain point, ultimately you can tell that these stories are redemption stories in the making, but they're all in different stages of finding that breakthrough, you know? So one person might write to me and say, you know, I've battled with addiction, but I went to a recovery program and spent a year there, and during that time, my life was radically changed, and I want to talk about that. So some people write to me looking back at their broken chapters, and some people write to me right in the middle of it. And to be honest with you, at the beginning, I got more than I thought I was asking for.
Well, I mean, 40,000 stories
Yeah.
is insane.
And stories that were that real,
Right.
you know, but I was blown away and really humbled by how honest people were willing to be. And what I began to pick up quickly was that there's a lot of people who really have just been waiting to know that their story matters and waiting for somebody to ask them and care enough to say, what's your story?
And so some of these stories have then obviously become songs. What's that process like? I mean, you write back to some of these people. Do you then have a deeper conversation as you're putting this? Like, take me through the process of turning these stories into songs.
Well, when the stories started pouring in more than I thought would come in. I mean, imagine this. So I was starting to have some success, right? So I knew how to write a song. I thought how to write a song that would maybe be a hit, and I was having some of those hits. And it was right at that time, coming out of that vocal cord surgery, where I completely ditched my go-to methods. And all of a sudden, here's a songwriter who's literally at the mercy of, will stories come in or not? And so for a while, I'm like, what if just one lady writes to me and lists the names of her cats or something? Like, how am I going to make a record about that?
A song about cats.
Exactly, a record about cats. Could you imagine? Maybe that'll be the next big thing.
It probably will
But
be.
thousands of stories coming in, and I'm overwhelmed. I thought, I need to get away. And so I found this little cabin that this lady owns. It was about 40 minutes away from my house. And for the last 6 years, that lady would rent her cabin to me for days or weeks at a time. She'd give me a key, she'd bake me a Danish or, have coffee for me, and I will drive from my house out to that cabin, and as I drive to that cabin, I start to feel like I'm getting away from the world, and I walk into that cabin, and it's me and thousands of stories and my guitar. And I start to read through stories, and every now and then a story will just pop out at me, and I feel like the story kind of picks me, and I begin to write a song based on a certain theme I'm picking up on or a certain story that I read.
So when you pick a person's story, right? It pops out, and then do you interact with them about it? Do you contact them? Are they part of that process?
Well, that's been one of the most amazing parts of the whole process was, the chance to reach back out to that person who's inspired a song and let them know, hey, I read your story and I wrote you a song. And we've done that in a number of ways. 2 weeks ago, our tour bus pulled up into a parking lot of a coffee shop in Omaha, Nebraska, where an 18-year-old high school senior who wrote her story and sent it to me was waiting, thinking that she was going to be part of a documentary. And instead, I walked in with my guitar and I said, do you remember writing your story to me? And she started crying. She's like, yeah. And I'm like, I read it.
Do you guys have that on video?
Yeah, we filmed it.
That's amazing.
And it's all like, so we film all these different, experiences. Last week, I called a pizza restaurant in a small town in Minnesota and asked to speak to the manager, saying I had a complaint about my pizza. But the truth is I was calling that guy because his name is Josh, and he told me his story of how he became the manager of that pizza restaurant and how years ago he was a convict in prison because of mistakes he'd made with drugs he'd gotten involved in, and he found jailhouse religion. But as he was getting out of prison, he said, I don't want to be the same person I was. I want to prove to everybody that I'm a changed man. But he said nobody would take a chance on an ex-convict, so he couldn't get a job, and he was tempted to think, well, I'm just going to go back to the life I once knew. But at his lowest point, this nice Christian couple who owned a pizza restaurant took a chance on an ex-convict, gave him a minimum wage part-time job in the back room. And he wrote to me to say, you know what? I committed to my change, and God helped me. He got me that part-time job. He said, I worked my way up, and today I'm the general manager. And I feel like I'm proof that you can change your life, and God can help you make the change and be a different person. So he inspired a song on the new record called Day One. And I got to call him on the phone, and he's like, are you punking me right now? I'm like, no, man, I read your story. And so this is the coolest part. I said, hey, have you heard my new song on the radio? He said, yeah. I said, it's your song.
That's crazy.
And he goes, he started crying, and this is what he said, and this gives me chills just thinking about it. He said, I heard that on the radio, and I told my wife, I feel like he's talking to me when he sings those words. And I started crying going, that's because you inspired those words. And so it's really developed a pretty special bond with, I guess, people that you would call fans.
No,
And
definitely.
It's like, it's just the coolest thing, man. My autograph lines after my shows are literally people who, yeah, they might want a picture, but many of them have an envelope in their hands, and it says my name on the front, and they've written their story down, and they place it in my hands as they walk by.
How have other artists reacted to this? I mean, have you heard reactions from other Christian artists, even secular artists, about what you're doing?
I haven't. That's funny. That's a great question. I haven't heard anything from like secular artists or anything like that. But among like the community of faith-based music and Christian music, I think a lot of them, a lot of them kind of joke with me like, I wish I'd have thought of that, But, I think a lot of them, obviously we know like one of the big buzz sentences or mottos about Nashville, which is where I live, in Music City, is it all begins with a song. And I think what we, the songwriters, know is that really it all begins with a story. And, if anything, I hope that it's encouraged the community of other artists to tune in a little bit to the audience that we're in front of, right? Instead of just being blinded by the lights on us, I think there's real power and the power of perspective that can come when you know the story of the people that you're actually hoping to reach. I always, I get a chance to speak with ministers and youth pastors a lot of times, and I challenge them to do the same exercise that I've done in music. Hey, you got a youth group? Why don't you give them the opportunity to even anonymously share their story with you? If you do that, you'll never wonder what you should speak about next Sunday.
That's really interesting. It's the polar opposite of how everybody kind of works, though, right? You think about yourself. You were saying the bright lights on an artist. You're thinking about yourself when you're putting music together, but you've sort of flipped that whole dynamic.
And when people say, wow, did you expect such and such song to resonate with the audience like it has? I kind of, and I don't mean this in like an overconfident way, but I actually don't feel like I'm just throwing darts at a wall and hoping something sticks anymore. I feel like I've kind of, forget Gallup, I've done my own research, and I'm getting these stories. And so when I'm writing a song about bullying, well, there's a reason why I'm writing that song.
And you know who the audience is.
Exactly.
I mean, you know who's listening to you, right? They're writing to you, and you know what they're facing.
Exactly. And so when I start, there's a song on one of my records called Two Houses. Well, the reason I wrote it is because it was a 16-year-old kid who's telling me what it feels like when dad decides he doesn't want to be your dad anymore. And she says, I want you to write my song. I want you to write a song for my sister too, and for every other kid who's come from a broken home, so that they can know that there's only one who will never abandon you. Even if they all walk out on you, your Heavenly Father's with you. So I write that song, and I start singing it at my shows, and guess what? The statistics are true, right? Over 50% of the people, I know that if it's not the person in front of me, it's the person sitting next to them who has that as a chapter in their story. And many people come up to me and they'll say, Two Houses, that's my story. Or Broken Girl, that's my story. Or so on and so on.
And you've done 3 albums, with these stories. Is there an end to it? Is this your process moving forward, right?
I really feel like it's become just woven into the fabric of my creative process. I don't know that like I was joking about an accidental trilogy of these 3 albums. I wrote these songs on this new record in such a way that I do feel like it bookends the beginning of my story journey and sort of a finality, but I honestly feel like I've been ruined for ordinary, because this has been the most fulfilling process, because I've seen the light in people's eyes when they hear their song for the first time. I've seen the ripple effect that it causes. When one person tells their story, it inspires a song. Now the stories I get 40,000 stories later are like second and third generation stories where people are saying, hey, this song that was inspired by this story, let me tell you how that impacted me. And so I can't see myself not being about story and being about encouraging people to recognize that their story is significant. In some way or form, my music will always come back to the power of the story that lies within all of us.
What is and this is a loaded question, there may not be a one answer, but what's the one story that you've seen that has just stuck with you the most out of any of them? Is there one?
I mean, there's many, but the first one that I thought of when you asked that question was the story of Renee Napier, who is a single mom who husband, decided he didn't want to be married anymore. So she's raising these kids, and she has 2 twin daughters. And she wrote to me, she said, no parent should ever have to say goodbye to their child like I have. But she said, that's my reality. One of her twins was on her way home from the beach one night when her car was struck by a drunk driver, a 24-year-old drunk driver named Eric. Eric was sentenced to 22 years in prison for his crime. But what she wrote to me was so powerful. She said, this young man was behind bars, but I was the one who felt like the prisoner. And she said the reason is because I was so eaten up in the days and weeks and months that followed the death of my daughter and the sentencing of this criminal. I was eaten up with anger and bitterness and rage. And that's all I could think about was how much I hated this man who's responsible for taking my daughter off of this earth. So any of us could certainly relate to the anger that she felt. But the rest of her story was so amazing to me, and it challenged me in a great way. She said she could barely get out of bed, and she would just cry out to God in her weakest moments and just say, God, I can't live like this. What do I do? How do I move forward? And she said over and over, she felt like God was reminding her about his gift of forgiveness that he's given to her. And she began to see that maybe her way out of this was to find the freedom of forgiveness. And so she reaches out to this guy who's serving 22 years and says, you know what, I forgive you because I love God and God has forgiven me and he commands me to do the same. And I want you to know that even though you're in prison, even though you've done this horrible thing, you can be forgiven too. That young man's life was so changed by her act of forgiveness that behind bars, he began a personal relationship with God as well and developed in his faith, started studying the Bible. They developed an unlikely friendship, writing letters, encouragement, to where she really had a heart for this young man. Long story short, she stood in front of a judge after he'd served 11 years and asked the judge to cut his sentence in half. The judge agreed, saying he'd never seen a greater act of kindness. After 11 years, Eric was released from prison, and to this day, the two of them travel and speak at schools, prisons, NFL locker rooms about the dangers of drunk driving, but also the power of forgiveness. 3 weeks ago, I stood in one of those maximum security prisons in Florida, and by my side was this woman and this young man as I sang their song, Forgiveness, and it was an amazing moment that I'll never forget.
Final question for you. What do you want people to get out of this album?
Well, the main theme of this new record is centered around a number, 86,400. That's how many seconds are in 24 hours. I Googled it, so that's how I know. And I literally did. I was online while I was writing the song. I'm like, how many seconds are in? And
Isn't
so
Google great?
Yeah, there's a chant in the song that really sums up the heart of this record. 86,400 seconds. Make them count. Make them matter. Make your now. Live forever. The story I just shared with you is the proof that no matter how many broken or damaged chapters we have that have already been written in our lives, ones that we can't change, that we wish we could do over, we don't have to be ruled by those chapters in our past. They don't have to dictate our future. And so I wanted to make this third album inspired by stories just to encourage people to go, hey, your best days are ahead of you. The best chapters of your story are yet to be written. Just as Renee discovered, yeah, she's got a painful past. She lost her daughter, but she's going to choose to move forward and live in honor of her daughter, not in defeat, but in victory, not in anger, but in forgiveness. And so that's the message of this record, making the most of our now, living our seconds in this life in such a way that it will leave a legacy behind us for others to follow and make an echo for eternity that secures our place in heaven when this life is over.
Well, listen, I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. Thanks for letting me share.